I'm Kwame Holman, and this is the DC Black Power Chronicles interview of Courtland Cox on May 17th, 2017. Courtland is a founding member of SNCC. He served as program secretary and on the steering committee for the March on Washington. He helped found the Drum and Spear bookstore in Washington, D.C. In 1973, he was Secretary General for the 6th Pan-African Congress. He worked with liberation movements across Africa and in minority business development for the first Marion Barry administration in 1979, and throughout a distinguished national and international career. Courtland, thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
Courtland, you were an intimate of Stokely Carmichael, you knew H. Rap Brown's brother. You knew all the important figures of the Black Power movement. As you think back now to what in Lowndes County or early on throughout the civil rights movement, as you had the nexus with the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, what is Black Power? What was Black Power as you creators perceived it?
I think as we perceived it, Black Power seems to me to be about black people being able to define who they were and decide their existence. I think the ability to define and decide was very important. And I'll tell you why. When we were coming along, and we're now talking, my period really starts, let's say, 1955, my consciousness of what was going on in the United States. Black people were defined in highly negative terms. Everything about them, from the width of their nose, to their hair, to their complexion, it was so that we hated ourselves. People used to bleach themselves with natanola. They used to straighten their hair with concholine. They used to try to use clothespins to narrow their noses. So there were a lot of things that we used to do that reflected self-hate. Black Power came along and said, black people are beautiful, just as they are, just as we were created, just as our hair, this nappy hair is great. We wore it natural. We don't have to put clothespins in our noses. We don't have to lighten our skins. So the ability to define just at that level was important. But then on the other level, in terms of definition, there was a whole sense that you were not intelligent, you were not smart. So everything from black people could not be quarterbacks, because they called for thinking. Black people could not be pitchers in baseball games at the professional level because they couldn't think. I remember in 1968 where there was a whole thing where the discussion was black people could run short distances, but they couldn't run long distances because it took strategy. And that was the year that Kipchoge Kino from Kenya came in, and I don't think a white person has won a long distance race since. But there was a whole thinking that was there. There was another level of terms of definition, how we got defined. Don't matter how smart you were, if you tried to go to college, they will always tell you, you really shouldn't do that. And if you were in high school, they wouldn't want you to take academic subjects, they want you to take vocational subjects. If you would take shop. So there was a whole conspiracy to make sure that you were not allowed to achieve. The other thing, like if you were a musician or if you were in the arts, you would create stuff, but other people would steal it and they would make money from it. And you couldn't control your rights. So you couldn't do what Jay-Z is doing now, or Stevie Wonder, or Puff Daddy, or any of these guys. So my sense is that the need to define And the ability to define who you are so you could act as a person was very important in terms of the discussion of Black Power. And the ability now to decide, what you could do, where you could go, who you were, what colleges you could go to, what you were taught in school, who you should associate with, what you should be named. All these things were very important. So I would say, in terms of the early discussion of Black Power, the ability to define who you were and your existence and decide what you would be doing in life in terms of the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness were the essential ingredients.
Why did it happen then? And as you said, the late 50s into the 1960s, and then the famous story begins to take shape. Why did you and Ivanhoe Donaldson and Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton and Willie Ricks and everyone come to that point, at that point, to say these things must be thrown off? I've heard in other interviews you talk about the being in Harlem and the influence on you of jazz music and I assume sort of out of the Harlem Renaissance kind of thing. Why do you think it happened for you and the rest of people then?
I think the real big turning point was World War II. I think what you had were a group of guys who were sent overseas to, quote, fight for freedom. And when they came back, people like Medgar Evers and Amzie Moore and Mr. Steptoe and people even like Miss Baker who didn't go over the war, or people like, A. Philip Randolph and people like Bayard Rustin and all these people, they saw the war and they saw what happened to the war. And a lot of them determined that they were not going to take it anymore. So you had a lot of political action. A lot of it was done through the courts. So a big piece was, the one big piece was the end of World War II. The other piece was Brown versus Board of Education, actually it's today, 1954, May 17th, when the Supreme Court decided that Plessy versus Ferguson, which said that segregation was the law of the land, Brown versus Board of Education reversed that, at least in the area of education. So then you had that. So then you also had, as you pointed out, the awakening. So you had in the rural area, you had three things going on. In the rural areas, you had the organizing of the NAACP, particularly in the South, on the vote. Nationally, you had Howard University and people like Naybrid and Spotswood Robinson and Thurgood Marshall moving in a legal way. And then in the urban areas, you had the explosion of creativity in terms of, at a lot of levels, in terms of music, in terms of jazz, because that was the big period in terms of jazz. In terms of literature, you had that, the Langston Hughes and others. And then you had the whole sense of, bigger possibilities. And then along with 54, and that, you remember 55, you had the Montgomery bus boycott. And then in 57, you had the Little Rock, the integration of the school in Little Rock. So that then, so in 1960, when then I'm 19 and the group, the people that you mentioned, they're all, Stokely, Ivanhoe, and I were all born in 1941. So we were all coming of age at that point. So we saw we really were standing on the shoulders of the veterans of World War II, the black veterans of World War II, the NAACP, the Roy Wilkins and all these others. And then the people, because when I grew up in New York, people were putting out magazines. I lived in the same building that Lou Donaldson lived in. You had all of that. I used to go down 125th Street and every corner on Lenox Avenue, 125th Street, somebody was on a ladder talking either about black nationalism, They were talking about, the ills of this country. I mean, the four corners had somebody on a ladder talking about it. So there was a great deal of vibrancy that, really gave us a sense that there were possibilities out there that probably the generations that before us didn't see.
Spike Lee, in his film Malcolm X, depicted that Harlem scene,
Right.
and Malcolm X is on one of those corners in Harlem and raised above the crowd.
No, I was there. I saw Malcolm. I mean, there's particularly the best corner on 125th Street was the one on where Michaud's bookstore was. So I mean, there was a great bookstore up there, and a lot of I mean, right then we had. You look at, because basically, again back to the definition. I mean, we were told we contributed nothing to history. That's why Carter G. Woodson, started back in, the early 1900s to try to create Negro History Week. There were just a few, A.J. Rogers, who, would have a little pamphlet called Great Men of Color. I mean, they were just, a few racemen who tried to go against the tide of negativity that was visiting us on a continuous basis. So my sense is that, there were a lot of disparate things that came into our view of the world, but I mean, you can see whether it was Mississippi with Amzie Moore or, Michaud in Harlem, there were all sorts of strivers in different ways for people to say we are a people and we are worth it.
You're talking about a movement as a whole, an awakening of African Americans in this country in the 50s and 60s, and yet there is the perception of a schism, a line between traditional civil rights leadership and their agenda and desire, and what you and others in the Black Power movement were calling for. It's as if, in shorthand, the traditional movement was asking, you were demanding, you were declaring. How close to reality was that schism? I mean, you were there on the podium at the March on Washington, trying to negotiate situations so that every group would be satisfied with what was going on. But how do you perceive that perceived schism between the traditionalists and people like yourself?
I would say it's much more generational. And people don't realize, I mean, when people think of Martin King, they think of him, I don't know what people think of him in terms of age, but Martin was killed before he was 40. He led the bus boycott at 26. And so you had on one end of the spectrum, Roy Wilkins and that generation. Then you had, you kind of had Martin King in the middle, and then you had us. And there were a lot of traditions, and then you kind of had, Ralph Bunche and others like that on the other end. And there were a lot of things that said, we as young people, said, what we see around us will not stand. We said that we are going to change this environment so that we could exist in it. Now, to their benefit, they saw the dangers. They saw that these people would kill you, that these people would do a lot of things. So my sense is that while they were not going to go to Mississippi with John Lewis, who, during the Freedom Rides, or they're going to not go to Alabama or join the sit-ins or go to even the Eastern Shore of Maryland, they weren't going to do that because they know what was going to happen. They were the ones who, when we were in jail, we could go to get the support for. They were the ones who would help explain to to as they say at that point, the white folks, that these aren't bad people. They're, so my sense is that my sense is that there was a generational piece there where we were prepared to deal with much more danger, to be much more bold. The other thing that we did, particularly in SNCC, that was important, that informed our lives, is that we were on the side of the least of these. That is to say, that we started out with the sit-ins, and we did a lot of sit-ins and the demonstrations. But when we went south to Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, we worked with the sharecroppers, people who this country had no value for, and we were the ones that tried to elevate them. And there was a disruption there. But my sense is, I think the big difference with us is probably the age. The age difference played probably, the generational piece probably played a bigger, bigger role in terms of the way we saw the world. Later on, it probably became political, but in the early days, I think it was much more generational.
You mentioned the violence against those standing against American apartheid.
Right.
I'm reminded that you talked in another interview about being motivated by the murder of Viola Liuzzo, of not having a real sense of the danger, the physical danger you put yourself in, and of riding with Ivanhoe Donaldson in a Volkswagen when you learned of the murder of Martin King. It's said that the images of fire hoses and German Shepherd police dogs helped turn the psychology of the country, of the majority in the country, toward understanding the civil rights movement. How do you perceive the role of the violent nature? Is it understood? Is it and why did it not dissuade so many of you from doing what you did?
I think the violence, the one violent piece that affected my generation more than any other was, the murder of Emmett Till. Just like the demonstration, the murder of Trayvon Martin, I think those are the kinds of things. And at that time, I was 14 years old. And when I talked to a lot of my peers who were 13, 14, they were impacted because Emmett Till was that age. So it said, that is something that can happen to us. I also think that, when we looked at all the violence, when we looked at, I think what you mentioned in terms of Viola Liuzzo, we were prepared. I think my mother would always say to me, she was both proud and scared to death. She would always try to figure out how she could get me to do this. She was all right with what was I doing, but she was very nervous about the violence. And I remember, we worked in Lowndes County, and I went to the trial of Collie Leroy Wilkin. And he was the person that accused of murdering Viola Liuzzo. I looked around, and I was the only black person in the room. And I said to myself, you must be really crazy, because these guys could disappear you and, nothing would be said. But I do think that, for most of us, for me, and it's kind of very interesting. All my life, I've looked at this issue from the inside out. So, a lot of what people perceive in terms of the fear and the violence, was there, but you had to figure out how to understand your circumstances and be able to function. Because I remember in Alabama, I was passing out leaflets for a mass meeting, and a lady said to me, boy, the sheriff know you here? I said, I guess so. I guess, yes, ma'am. She said, boy, you ain't dead yet? Because the community understood, you know, the sense of violence that would attend what we were trying to do. But I must also say that it was the community that protected us. Because one of the things that you have to, as particular when we're in the South, in Mississippi and Alabama, it was, we did not carry guns. We were nonviolent. But the community had guns. And they really respected us for our abilities to carry on and to be brave. But they also knew the realities. And I know when I was in Lowndes County, Mr. Jackson used to be up at night in the field next to the house with his shotgun, ready to protect us. So my sense was that, you know, violence was all around us. I mean, as I said, you know, the violence in terms of understanding it with Emmett Till, understanding the nature of what was going on with Viola Liuzzo, the nature of understanding of Sammy Young, who was a SNCC person who was killed at the gas station, just the brutality that we face, you know, the murder of Medgar Evers, the shooting of Jimmy Travis. I mean, we knew it, but we, you know, the murder of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. We knew it, but we knew that if we were paralyzed by it, things would not change. So I think, as I think of violence, it's still hard for me to really be overwhelmed by it. But when if I sometimes think about it from the outside in, as opposed to the inside out, you know, looking at my life, you know, you begin to shake your head and say, boy, I mean, there was some interesting times.
Indeed, indeed. The famous Civil Rights Acts pushed forward by the actions of you and others and by Lyndon Baines Johnson came to pass in the late 60s. And there came a period in the early 70s, because I want to lead into the Marion Barry era and your involvement there, but I wonder if you had a sense that after the major civil rights laws, public accommodations, et cetera, became law, that things in the movement for personhood for African Americans hit a plateau in any way. I mean, it was like the disco era or something, and the civil rights movement was not at the forefront as it had been. There was Nixon and Watergate and what have you. What was your thinking in the early and mid 70s?
Yeah, I mean, you see, my view is that this is a journey. For me, here's the kind of chronology I have. You know, in the early 60s, I was involved in protests, trying to bring about certain kinds of awareness, as they say, speaking truth to power and all that. And I think for a lot of us, it became clear that the demonstrations and being in the street and being in resistance was not going to be enough, because this was a power discussion. So a lot of us started engaging in the vote. And when we started engaging in trying to register people to vote, it was also clear to us that if just registering people to vote was not enough, political organization was important. So we put together the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, even though it could not be an official entity, political entity, electoral entity. It was an alternative that began to challenge the Democratic Party as to what in fact it was able to do in terms of dealing with all the rhetoric it was putting out there vis-a-vis the black community. So in 1964, at the Atlantic City Challenge, when they did not, in fact, really respect what we were trying to do and then respect the rhetoric that they said, we began to think differently. And we said we cannot try to integrate into the Democratic Party and become part of that. So we moved to Lowndes County. And we started talking about black people now beginning to control their own realities. Even if it was on a county level and using that experiment. We said if we're 80%, because Lowndes County was 80% black, they had 4 black people registered to vote. We said as opposed to just getting them registered to vote, we need to have regime change so that they need to be every elected office in the city. So in the county. So we're talking about sheriff, we're talking about tax assessor, tax collector, probate judge, all the things, everything. And we knew these people, a lot of them couldn't read and write, but we devised a way to not just get them to vote, but a regime change take over the county. So we were now beginning to think of power, not only just voting, but controlling the vote, controlling the electoral office, controlling the resources. Then we moved on, at least I moved on, begin to understand that while this was a big experiment in Lowndes County, it would not deal with the urban areas. It wouldn't deal with a number of things. So, we engaged in a lot of discussions about, that was a period when Black Power came out in '66. And so we came here to DC, we did Drum and Spear Bookstore, we did the Center for Black Education. We taught actually what was Federal City College, at the predecessor to UDC. And so we then, understood that we needed to do more. So then we moved on to, well, at least I moved on to trying to reach out to Africa in the 6th Pan-African Congress. And then after that, understanding that had its limitations, I came back here and went to the Barry administration. So for me, at least for me in my case, while I wasn't visible in terms of demonstrations and all that, in the late 60s, early 70s, I was still on a continuous journey to try to find answers to the problems that we face, which is something that, that I still continue to do, so that the visibility to me didn't make a big difference. My being engaged in the struggle in ways trying to figure out how to do it and where to go, whether I was in Africa or whether I was, in Lowndes County, that for me was the big issue. And I think that while all the stuff that wasn't visible, while a lot of stuff wasn't visible, it didn't mean that nothing was happening.
Indeed. Did you have a sense, though, that the American public at large felt that a page had been turned with
they want to turn the page, because for a lot of Americans, the 60s were terrible. The 60s were disruptive. The city, because basically you had a status quo. You had a status quo. I mean, first of all, most of the teams, most of the baseball teams and the basketball teams and all of those 50s were all white. Now you're beginning to have black people come in. It got so, I'm sure I looked at the Miss USA pageant the other night. Of the 10 people who were finalists, 6 were people of color. So for them, they're saying, it used to be all white. What has happened to us? We want our country back, which is part, while this was a small thing in the 60s, because, where they had a father knows best and it was every, white male dominated discussion, Now you're having a discussion where they now have to share America with a bunch of other people that don't look like them. And this is a big cultural and psychological problem, that has caused a lot of disruption. So while they thought that the 60s were bad, we think that this period is bad because whose interest is being served.
You continued your activism, as you say, and so did many others after the page was being turned in the late 60s and early 70s, and that included being in Washington. And you've talked in your Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture interview, and in your Gelman Library, George Washington University interview, you talk about coming to Washington and seeing that far from there being all the problems that brought you into the fight for personhood, far from those problems being solved, you found a Washington that was segregated, where people were locked out, African Americans were locked out of the economic mainstream, and that was the way it was everywhere. You decided, along with others, to start to get involved in trying to change that.
Yes. I mean, Washington, when I came here, I came to Washington in 1960, January of 1960. There were no black bus drivers because Roy Chalk, who owned the bus system, DC Transit, said they would steal the money. There was no home rule, so the people and the Congress ran the city, and the chairman, I think his name was McMillan, was from South Carolina. You had black policemen. You didn't have any black policemen of any significance anywhere. Washington Post, which is the great, quote, liberal newspaper at this point, they used to have ads for blacks and whites. So they had a colored section for black people. The black people didn't hold any significant offices anywhere around, including in the law firms. They were not partners. In the accounting firms, they were not partners. In the newspapers, they were not, reporters. On TV, they were not there. I mean, people who see today can't imagine how segregated this town was when I first came here in 1960. And I think, we had segregated restaurants. Clifton Terrace was all white. We had segregated housing. So I think that, you couldn't help but be involved in trying to change the circumstance, because Washington, D.C. was definitely a southern town.
Mm-hmm. You came to know Marion Barry, and you got involved in the campaign, and you became an integral part of, along with many other people coming from a wide range of backgrounds, blacks, whites, gays, etc., in pulling off an upset victory for Marion Barry in 1978. Did you and Marion Barry, former head of SNCC, come to that surprise, if you will, victory with the idea that we are going to bring the principles of SNCC, of the Black Power movement, to the administration of the city of Washington?
I think it was just in our being. I tell young people all the time, the real issue in any government and any campaign is whose interest is going to be served. That is in fact determined by where the budget is spent. It is determined by what policies exist. It is determined by what the cabinet looks like. It's determined by what the laws look like. And so we came in to actually was very interesting, that campaign. You know, yeah, it was, I guess it was a surprise because probably everybody assumed Sterling Tucker might win because he was, you know, supported actually by most of the black middle class in Washington, and Marion was not. And so, but I don't think we came in and said, if we win, you know, we're gonna put black power. No, we came in, and the people who were critical, I mean, Marion had a critical mass of SNCC people around him, you know, Ivanhoe and others, who understood, you know, that we had to act in the interests of a broad group of people who had been left out. So you mentioned, you know, the gay community, and the gay community, Gertrude Stein was big in helping Marion get elected. You know, people in Southeast who were neglected, Marion loved the seniors loved Marion. Marion, a big thing in terms of young people, you know, the Summer Youth Project, you know, Marion did a number of things. So, I mean, we understood that you had to broaden the base of the people who participated and benefited from government. And I don't think we had any statement about that, but, you know, given that the majority of people in this city were black, then in fact, the people who were gonna benefit from it would be black, because we're gonna expand, you know, who the city served from the small group of people that it used to serve.
The Barry administration, the cabinet that attracted professionals like yourself with long experience doing myriad kinds of work. There were high profile people, Elijah Rogers, others who came and created a superstar cabinet, if you will, in 1979 and thereafter. But you had, as part of your agenda, like Lowndes County, a spoken ideal of empowering poor people. And that wasn't common.
No, definitely. I mean, Marion was very clear. I mean, Marion benefited, I think maybe 3, 4, 5 people. Now I'm thinking about it from the outside in. I think, as I mentioned, the people who have been locked out in a lot of ways and despised in the gay community is one. I would say, you know, the people in east of the river, you know, particularly senior citizens, the people who were being put in jail and trying to deal with those issues, the people who did not have possibilities of a future, and he did a number of things with young people. So that's one group. But Marion helped tremendously the black middle class. I mean, so particularly law firms who wanted to do business with the city, accounting firms, the Washington Post, and then I remember the Wall Street firms, the Merrill Lynches, and all these people who wanted to do government bonds. So they would send their usual suspects down. And Marion said to them, if you want to do business with me, don't send anybody that doesn't look like me. They got the message. So the law firms began opening up, the accounting firms, the Wall Street firms, the Washington, all these people began to get the message that Marion had the center of power. So it wasn't, it's not a call for black power, which is aspirational. It was of having the center of power, which made the difference. So if they wanted, and the budget was smaller than, I think we were maybe $5.2 billion, and which is, a couple of dollars at that point. If you wanted to deal with the people who control this budget of $5.2 billion, you had to change your ways. And you could have that discussion. The other thing that really surprised me, I was in a cabinet meeting and I was sitting next to the police chief. And I mean, it was hard for me to really get my mind around it because every time I saw a police chief, we were on the opposite sides of anything. And I'm sitting next to the police chief, and I'm sitting in the room, and decisions are being made. So my sense is I realized I had been both in protest and power. Protest, you're protesting decisions that have been made. Power, you're making decisions, and you're making the direction. So I said to myself, I've been in both protest and power, and I think power is much more effective. Being able, if I wanted to help the black community, if I wanted to help the people who are poor, who've been disfranchised, being in protest is one thing. And that if you don't have power, that's all you have. But seeking power to be able to define and make a difference is a very important thing. Because if at the end of the day, that's what people care about, that your ability to affect their lives in ways that make a difference. And I think that, my sense of our ability to seek power is something that we have not really incorporated. I mean, I think we have had the discussion of black power, and it helped. I mean, it helped tremendously. I think the slogan for Black Power helped tremendously because it allowed us to think of ourselves differently. It allowed us to think that we should be in power. What Marion did was we were able to achieve power by, as you said, a surprise move, and then we were able to actually make a difference in the lives of thousands and thousands of people.
In fact, it's been said that Marion Barry, through his various, and the rest of you in the administration, through the various administrations, created from a nascent black middle class in Washington, government workers and so forth, by bringing in people who would work for accounting firms and law firms and et cetera, created and exponentially increased the size of the black middle class in Washington, some of whom moved to Prince George's County and created a major tax base there as well. And it's one of the things you have talked about with respect to the famous shortcomings of Marion Barry that doesn't get discussed when people are talking about Mr. Barry's personal life versus the things he achieved, the way he changed the city and its inhabitants.
Yeah, I mean, I think Marion had his own issues, but I also think that there is a lesson to be learned here because in a lot of ways, that whole thing about physics, for every action there is an opposite and equal reaction. I think Marion's first term, everybody would agree that in terms of bringing a professionalism to this city, everybody would agree that it was unparalleled. So what began to happen is that Marion started talking about minority business development. And basically it's centered around the whole issue of procurement. While people in the white community and the power structures were not pleased with it, they could get along. They, a lot of them. But where Marion crossed the line and they really decided to go after him was Marion said that 25% of all equity participation in downtown development had to go to the African American community. They said, you're messing with our money and you have lost your mind. So basically what began to happen is, and this is the way they always come at you, they began to talk about Marion stealing and the people around him stealing and stuff like that. But Marion really didn't care about money. I mean, he was literally did not care about money. But that's the way they came at him first. And so people don't remember that the Washington Post, again, started writing all these articles about stealing and all this corruption. And, it's centered around Marion, because we used to have a poker game. Ivanhoe and Elijah Rogers and others and myself, we used to play poker. And the question was, were they passing money to Marion and so forth? Marion would generally lose in those poker games, and people would laugh at him. But they've tried to create that aura around him. So Marion, so they started talking about corruption and stealing. And the Washington Post started driving the discussion. Then the U.S. Attorney, Joe DeGenova, picked it up and investigated. And the Post got frustrated because DeGenova wasn't doing the job that they wanted them to do to get Marion. And they had to give it up because they could find no stealing and no corruption, because Marion cared nothing about money. So they decided then, okay, what is a weakness that he has? And, and women clearly was one of Marion's weakness. Messing with, other women and so they brought this woman who was a friend of his into the discussion, and basically there was a whole discussion about her pressing him. He wanted to have sex. She wanted, saying, well, if you're going to do that, we have to have drugs. And so it was the setup. And that is that's what people you see, Marion stands, let's go back to this. Marion cannot stand as a symbol of seriousness and hope for black people, because he would stand for a situation of power and how they should act. You look at, there are probably about 5 mayors in this, Coleman Young, Maynard Jackson, Marion, Harold Washington, and recently Chokwe Lumumba. Chokwe and Harold died of heart attacks. They destroyed Young. They tried to destroy Marion, and they isolated Maynard. This country cannot, at this point, stand a black person who is seen to be acting in the interests of the black community. And also, even with Barack Obama, when Michelle and and Barack did the fist bump, which everybody. They had a whole, the bandoliers and, this whole sense of, these wild people with guns and so forth. In their head, any strength in black community is seen. Even when LeBron James decided that he was going to move from Cleveland to Miami, the whole sense that he, in fact, could determine his own life and have strength. In baseball, this brother, his name is escaping me, who really established free agency and moved out into this country. When you looked at '68 Olympics, Tommy Smith and Carlos, any time a black person is seen to have strength, there is a need to destroy him, because in a lot of ways, this country cannot stand that. So while Marion clearly on the issue of women was not a saint, what you have coming at you is not about, they don't care about Marion and the women. They care about his being a symbol of power. And they have got to substitute their image of him for the image that we might have. And so, and what I find interesting is that whether you're talking about the black community or whether you're talking about people who are poor or middle class or upper class, they have a very strong support of Marion. The white community can't deal with it. Let me go back to another point about black power, this discussion of black power. Most of the white liberals, even people who were in SNCC and other places like that, when the utterance of black power and defining yourself and being the person that you want to be, that was not viewed as a way of establishing your humanity, or as you talk of personhood. It was viewed as being anti-white, and high negativity comes with that. So my sense is that in this country, whether we're talking about Marion Barry, whether Curt Flood is the guy, the baseball player, whether we're talking about Curt Flood, who established stood up on the question of free agency, whether you're talking about a LeBron James in certain circumstances, if there is a sense that the relationship is changing where whites are on top and blacks are on the bottom, if there's a sense that you're trying to create some equality or even a power relationship that's different, there is high negativity, and the first way they're going to come at a politician is corruption.
So is Courtland, the Black Power agenda of today the same as before, to make right those wrongs that prevent people from living fully the way they would wish to live, and that may include having more success than their white counterparts? And does it involve a diverse sense of equality and opportunity for everyone, for gays, for everyone? I've heard you say recently that poor whites and African Americans, and this was a discussion, and I contrasted with what you said back in the 60s, if you will, that the question on the table was whether whites could be part of what SNCC was going to do, and some of you in SNCC said, go to the white community and reform there. You've said recently that there is an agenda of poor whites and black people that is possible, and it's something that Malcolm X talked about as well. What is the Black Power agenda of today?
Well, there are two or three things. I think that poor whites probably have it worse than poor blacks in a lot of ways, because they're invisible. They're called by their own community called poor white trash, and there is nobody who stands up for them. And they get run over continuously and just used. What the poor black community has is the black middle class, and they're attached to each other by race. So the black middle class fears that if they don't stand up for blacks in the poor community, they will also be hurt. So at least there is that thrust that of the black community. Now, that
opportunity could be taken back, and that middle class blacks could slip back
in. So that thrust is a big generator of hope and power for the total black community. Now, I think Trump has made a big difference. I think that let's say from Trayvon Martin on, when I talked to a lot of young black people, resistance was the thing. Being in the streets was the thing. I mean, they were the question of, gay community and so forth, poor community, they were all good with that. But they wanted to be in the streets, because they thought that that's where you did things. And when we try to talk to them about the vote and so forth, it's all right, but now they're very clear. They now understand the vote and power makes a difference. But they also understand that the federal government is not their friends. So what I'm beginning to see is a lot of young blacks talking about organizing and gaining political power at the local and state level. So my sense is that they are now thinking about power. They're now thinking about coalitions, whether with environmentalists or with women, Planned Parenthood or so forth, they're thinking about coalitions. But they now know that being in the streets is not enough. They now have to be at the centers of power where decisions are made, because they now see that along with the Hispanic community and others, the only way they could protect themselves from various forces is to actually begin to hold some of these political offices and elected offices. So my sense is that I think today, Trump has been a very clarifying event for young blacks when I talk to, because I'm telling you, before the election, telling them that, you needed to get involved because you will be destroyed if you don't. It was because they assumed that things would go as they were going. And you could never face the danger that they face today. And now Trump has been a clarifying event. And they're now beginning to focus. I don't have to talk about the vote anymore. I don't have to talk about the need to gain elected office. I don't have to do that anymore because they understand it in ways that I couldn't talk to them about it. So I think as I look at today, I find a lot of young black people who are very smart, very energetic, and we're beginning to move in the right direction. I don't think in these environments they're going to articulate black power as a singular piece. They're going to talk about power for black people, but they're also going to relate to other entities in and around them. And, at some point, I think they feel that they need to overwhelm the forces on the other side that have now, gained control of the federal government. So that's kind of what I see at this point.
And finally, Courtland, to the extent that some of those very smart young people, Mr. McKesson at Black Lives Matter, some of the women there, understand a SNCC legacy, a Black Power legacy, having studied it as many of them had. You've talked about the need for generalized education about the movement and how, as being an important thing, what would that accomplish? Why hasn't it happened? Why don't K through 12 know about it? And how can that be accomplished?
Okay. I want to talk about two things. The institutional question that you raised, and then another question. I think a lot of the young people look to SNCC. And I tell these millennials, I kind of joke with them, pull their leg, and saying, well, these guys, some of them, they go up to 35. I said, when I was in SNCC, anybody over 28 was considered old. So, you guys who think you're young, we were 17 to 21 when we were in SNCC. But they respect what we have done and, call on us to talk to their group. And one of the things that, the SNCC Legacy Project, which I'm working with, is trying to do is hold a lot of intergenerational discussions politically. Now, I think the other question you asked, the K through 12 and college and so forth. I think before, I would say before 20 years ago, the history that, well, basically everything was, Rosa Parks sat down, Martin King stood up, and, the world was all right. And everything was centered around Martin King. But over the past 20 years, there has been a campaign to collect a lot of documents and so forth about the movement. I mean, we've really made a long way, gone a long way. CrimVets, which is out in California, has a website, CrimVets website. Then we have now done the SNCC Digital Gateway. This discussion will be part of it. And we are now collected enough documents so that we can get teachers to begin to have a body of work that they can look at. So in fact, in July, we're bringing together teachers in Mississippi who will begin to look at the movement history and be able to teach that in class. And we want to expand that. So I think we're in the first step of beginning to do what is necessary for education. We're collecting the education, the documents that can be the basis of the education and teaching materials. And, maybe the next, I would say next 5 to 10 years, we need to begin to have a cadre of educators, I would say from the grammar school all the way to post, college, where we would begin to tell the story, begin, and again, as I started, be able to define what history is and decide where we want to go with it. I think that again is the real question. Our ability to define who we are and to decide how we pursue life, liberty, and happiness.
Courtland Cox, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.